Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Actually, today, as David mentioned, it's been a while. We haven't seen each other in person or through the staircase in the David Attenborough building, which I actually miss a lot. But yeah, well, better times will come for sure. We can give a minute if you want, because it's supposed that the session starts at half. So it's 29.
We're okay. We're okay, Cristina.
We are okay? Okay.
Yeah, we can go.
We can go ahead. That's fine. As David has introduced me, I'm not gonna waste more of the time of the audience introducing me again. And I think Matthew has a very interesting topic to talk about today. So we are very, very lucky to have with us Dr. Matthew Agarwala. He's a leader for the Wealth Economy Project at the Bennett Institute. He's an environmental economist interested in wealth-based approaches to measuring and delivering sustainable development. He joined the Bennett Institute's Wealth Economic Project to transform economic measurements to better reflect sustainability, inequality, and human well-being. He regularly consults for governments and scientific organizations on topics of natural capital, ecosystem services, and sustainability. And something that I like to emphasize always is that he has a very multidisciplinary profile, and he has worked across sectors and across disciplines with an extensive network in several countries across the world: Germany, Canada, Japan, the US, and of course through the UK. Dr. Matthew Agarwala is also affiliated to LSE, specifically to the Department of Geography and Environment and the Grantham Research Institute, and also to the Center for Social and Economic Research on Global Environment at the University of East Anglia. As I mentioned, he is going to talk to us towards a very interesting topic about the wealth economy. So Matthew, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and thank you very much to you as well.
Thank you very much, Cristina. That's a very generous introduction, so thank you for that. Let me just try to share my screen and confirm now that you can see the screen you're supposed to see and not my presenter view. Can somebody
we can see the screen.
Right, so not my presenter view.
No,
so this is correct.
It's fine.
Right. Perfect. So in that case, let's just dig in. I'm going to talk to you a bit about a brand new report we're just putting the final touches on now from our Wealth Economy project at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. But I'm also going to jump into a couple of things that I think will be relevant for this particular forum around biodiversity and pandemics and the economy. Essentially, the things that I want to get across are that we need a new way of thinking about our economy and a new way of understanding the structures within it. Once we can do that, I think we can actually start moving towards a more prosperous, more resilient, more sustainable future that actually delivers on the targets that we continually set and so far continually miss with respect to biodiversity or climate change or any number of other public policy goals. So the project is the Wealth Economy Project, and I've put the covers here of our first couple of reports, and we're about to release a new one. We're just sending off to the printers a little bit later today. The general idea, the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings of this project come actually from a great Cambridge economist, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, and a few others as well, the late David Pearce, Kerry Turner, Giles Atkinson. And essentially, everything that I'm going to tell you today stems from one simple observation. And this is the theoretical framework that has given that observation to us. It's that our economy, from the smallest subsistence farms all the way to the biggest companies on the planet, our entire economy operates and exists within the context and confines of the natural world. And everything else I'm going to tell you today stems from that simple observation. It means that we can't escape what happens in nature any more than a smoker's lungs can escape the smoke. We're part of the same integrated system. And what that means is that when we invest in nature, in maintaining and enhancing wild spaces and ecosystems and critical natural capital assets, then we're actually expanding the operating space for the economy. Formally, in economics, we would say we're pushing forward the possibility frontier, that framework of what is actually achievable in the economy for the entire future. And these are some of the ideas that I expect we're going to see in the Dasgupta review, which is commissioned for the first time by the Treasury, the financial decision-making in this country. The basic underpinning is about 70 years of calculus, or one slide with 2 pictures on it. The basic underpinning here, the simple theoretical construct that we need to accept, is that the size of the pie we have in the future depends on the stock of ingredients that we have in the pantry. And if we are running out of milk and eggs and butter in the pantry, then we will have a smaller pie in the future. But so far, our economic statistics have focused solely on the size of the pie, on GDP, the amount of income in an economy within a year. If instead of looking just at the size of the pie, we started to measure and value those core economic ingredients that we combine together to generate human wealth and prosperity, things like physical infrastructure, things like human capital, the skills and knowledge and health of the labor force, things like natural capital, those components of the natural world that generate goods and services that underpin all other economic activity. And if we measured these, and if we took them seriously and protected them and enhanced and expanded our stocks, then the pie that we could have in the future doesn't have to be smaller. It could stay the same size or even grow. Now, we're about to release a brand new report, which moves away from just the theory and the ideas here into concrete actions that policymakers could take right now. The first of these is to establish a new green Marshall Plan. We'll all be familiar with the Marshall Plan following the Second World War that helped deliver finance in order to reconstruct Europe, and then actually expanded around the world to reconstruct after the Second World War. One of the things we don't remember quite so frequently is that the development of metrics like GDP at the same time as the Marshall Plan was being implemented meant that the plan had a clear metric to benchmark success and to determine which investments are working and how to move forward. So that metric of GDP wasn't just a measure of the economy, but it was also something that was used to shape investment across the delivery of the Marshall Plan. And what we need now is a new measurement framework that builds us forward towards a more resilient economy. And it does so by replenishing our stock of economic ingredients, that human capital, the social capital, and the natural capital. Right? Now, the objective is not just to build back what we used to have, but a little bit better, tinkering around the edges. The objective is to fundamentally change the way we manage economies by changing the way that we manage capital, all kinds of capital, including nature, including social relationships and trust, our social capital. And the value of all capital is inherently forward-looking, right? The value of your stock portfolio today is determined by the expectations of what we think these companies are going to do in the future. Right? The same is true with all other wealth. So what we need to do is develop forward-looking metrics that build forward to a greener, safer, cleaner, quieter, more resilient, sustainable economy. Now, one of the questions that I keep getting is, how are you going to pay for it? There's no money. The Treasury is bankrupt. And it's true, public finances are in a worse state now than at any other point in my lifetime. But it is also true that interest rates are low. It is also true that governments this year, during the biggest economic shock of our lives, have been able to find into the tens of trillions of dollars to invest and to provide stimulus packages. So even in the heart of the biggest crisis, we've found tens of trillions of new financial resources. The objective now is to make sure that we funnel those funds into investments that build us forward, rather than waste them trying to prop up the dying industries of the past. We have sections on social capital and on human capital, which for time purposes, I won't go into in too much depth just now, but I will send out the links as soon as they're ready so you can see the report in full. We're also going to give some direct policy actions, things like developing a national investment bank with a strong green mandate to make sure that we can actually allocate the funds to shovel-ready projects that get people to work now and keep them employed through the medium term until the rest of the economy is able to pick up and they won't need the government support quite so much. Now, one of the things that I really want to get into is this link between biodiversity and pandemics and economics. It's very poorly understood. There's been a huge amount of interest very recently for obvious reasons, but essentially as economists, we struggle to understand some of the basics around how biodiversity impacts our economies and how we might manage these risks. The first thing, and the hard stuff to do, is figuring out whether or not biodiversity actually increases or decreases the risk of future pandemics. There seems to be a couple of different schools of thought here. On the one hand, if you have the parking lot ecosystem and there's no diversity and there's not very many species, then we're unlikely to get a zoonotic jump. On the other hand, if we don't have reservoir species that can absorb some of this, if we don't have the predators that can take away some of the pests, then we're really going to struggle, and these zoonotic jumps are going to keep taking place. 75% of emerging infectious diseases at this point have a zoonotic origin. It's not just COVID. As I'm sure you're all fully aware, it's also Ebola and SARS and MERS, and before that, HIV. There's a lot of interest at the moment purely on viruses, but we have to bring back this, all of the attention that we've focused on viruses at the moment. We also need to spend as much effort on understanding antibiotic and microbial resistance, particularly the way that we use antibiotics to prop up unsustainable agricultural systems. We need to figure out precisely which are the critical biomes and where exactly we need to invest in maintaining protected areas. Now, there's been great work on this, including just this week. We've seen Bernardo have another piece in I think, Nature, talking about where are the hotspots, the priority areas for biodiversity conservation. But then we get to the really hard stuff, right? The really hard stuff, which is once we know these things about what do we need to protect and where and how much of it, how do we actually get policy to shift? The biodiversity targets that we set in 2002 for the year 2010 weren't met. The ones that we set in 2010 and HE for 2020 weren't met, not one of them. So rather than just creating new targets and missing them, what are we going to do that's different in my relationship with policymakers to actually get things to change? All right? The stuff that we know, I mean, one of the things that's very easy is demonstrating that the benefits to biodiversity, the benefits to pandemic preparedness, and the benefits even to lockdowns, the economic benefits at least, vastly outweigh the costs. There's a new report led by Brundtland, yes, the same Brundtland, which shows that actually it would take about 500 years of spending on pandemic preparedness to meet just 1 year of this pandemic's economic costs. Right? The costs are astronomical. One of the reasons that we struggle with addressing these sorts of preparedness issues, and it's not just pandemics, it's climate, it's broader biodiversity, it's water, it's desertification, it's infectious diseases, right? Is this tragedy of the horizon. how do we get people to make decisions today with respect to risks that might arise in the future? We haven't cracked this. And we knew 5 years ago, and we knew 10 years ago, and 20, and even 50 years ago, that destruction of nature could have costs, but it was always too far into the future. And we're in the exact same place now with climate change. One of the other really hard things to do, which I find increasingly frustrating, is keeping our allies, the people who we should be working with, on side, right? And for that, I'm going to move to the next piece. We know some of the things that we need to do to bend that curve of biodiversity loss. This came from, this figure I've taken from the Global Biodiversity Outlook, recently released. But those of you who will know the literature will see that it's very closely modeled after one of the late Regina Mesa's papers in Nature Sustainability in 2018 on how to bend this curve, right? We need to develop a more nature-centric agricultural system. We need to develop and expand conservation areas. We need action on climate change. We need production and consumption patterns to change. Which kind of economy do you think is best placed to make these changes? One that's growing and healthy, or one that's characterized by degrowth, a deliberate shrinking and reduction in the size and capacity of the economy? Right? This is what I'm talking about when we're trying to keep allies on side. There is a group of economists and others too, who are pushing to deliberately impose economic depressions, not recessions, but depressions, permanently decreasing the size of the economy. And they do this on the belief that we will, in that smaller, poorer, weaker economy, be better placed to develop the new technologies, the new infrastructure, and the new economic systems that are necessary to move us towards a low carbon, climate resilient economy.
Let's now come to the second issue.
So I think I'm hearing.
Yeah, and Trishan, mute yourself, please.
15 between.
Right. Okay, I'll just move on. I've only got a couple more slides. I think I might finish a bit of schedule. So I talked a bit about the tens of trillions that have now been made available in life support for the economy and in recovery packages for the economy. A group, Vivid Economics, based in London, has developed a greenness or a green stimulus index to rank countries on the green qualities of their COVID stimulus packages. It's not a perfect measure. For instance, the UK looks to be one of the best in the world. But the reason that it looks so strong here is that according to the metrics of the index, the UK is already in very strong environmental shape. It's starting from a very high level. I think that's highly debatable. But the problem that I want to really point out here is we've already spent into the hundreds of billions, or committed into the hundreds of billions in stimulus in the UK. And the package, the recovery package, included 3 billion for green investments. Now, 3 billion is a lot of money, but it's a bit less than we spend on chocolate in a year. So if what we want to do is really use this massive public spending at the moment to invest in that broad stock of economic ingredients, the infrastructure that's low carbon and climate resilient, the housing that's energy efficient, the human capital, the skills and knowledge that's necessary for the new economy. If we want to direct that funding towards this wealth-based economy, then we're going to need to really ramp up the green weights within our stimulus packages. So the question that I'm asking policymakers when I'm on panels with them now or in conversations is, what's actually going to change as we go forward? Because I've been in this area for around 10 years now. I didn't start it. People on this call have been working in this area for half a century, probably, right? We've known for a long time the things we need to do in policy in order to improve the environment and in order to improve economic outcomes, but we've still struggled to get it to happen. So if we take what might be a bit of a cynical approach to the history of environmental policy, we could see that it's essentially 3 steps. You set a target, you miss it, and then you repeat. And we've done that time and time again with biodiversity targets, with climate targets, etc. So what I want to know from policymakers is, what are they going to do differently? And when you go and speak and meet with policymakers and give advice, if you could ask these questions and come back to me, I would be immensely grateful. I want to know what's going to change in their diary. If I were to take all of the text describing all of the diary appointments for all of the parliaments going back 20 years, it would tell me something about who they're meeting, how frequently, and how long they're meeting with them. What I want to know is, after a new target is set, will I see a structural change in the data of who they're meeting, how frequently, and for how long? I want to know what bills they have supported in the past, which they now wish to amend or repeal. What's actually going to change? And I want to know which campaign contributors they have courted in the past, who they will no longer accept funds from, and which sources they're going to instead. And until policymakers can start answering these questions to me, I'm pretty well inclined to dismiss their statements about 30 by 30, 30% of the surface area of the UK will be managed for nature by 2030. I'm pretty inclined to dismiss this as cheap talk and greenwash. Now, it's not just for policymakers. I've got 40 seconds left. And what I want to do in that time is express that these challenges are not just for policymakers. It's not just them, it's us too. What I want to know from you in the questions and in the comments is, what are we as academics going to do differently? Because our previous strategy hasn't gotten us where we need to be. So what do we do differently tomorrow that we weren't doing 5 years ago and 10 years ago? And for that, I think I'll pass it back to Cristina to field some questions.
Thank you very much for such a fascinating talk, Matthew. A lot of food for thought for everybody. I think we have 10 minutes left for questions. Please, you can write in the chat Q or comment, and I will give you the floor right after. Let's see if we have some questions. If not, I will take actually the first word. And I am very interested in the first part of your presentation, which actually connects very well with your last part. What are we going to do as academics? In my new role as a lecturer, I have this feeling that we really need to teach the new generations in a different way in certain topics. Climate change, biodiversity difficulties and problems is one of those. At the beginning, you mentioned that with new approaches, with the new or renew or proper tasks, we could actually expand the resources in the land, in the world. And what we teach actually in Economics 101 is that economics is the science of managing and allocating scarce resources. So my question is, what do we have to teach to undergrads? Or if you think we can change the way we teach from the very beginning what economics is about, for example, in order to impact this social capital that will be the one that will change the future and actually the present?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, just before logging on for this meeting, I was revising a section for the new report addressing this directly. So human capital is that stock of skills and knowledge that we have in the economy. We're building human capital now. When we get degrees, when we study, we're building human capital. It's also related to the health of the population, because of course a healthy worker is a more productive and more profitable worker. So one of the ideas we've been batting around is, what can the higher education sector do? What can the vocational training sector do differently that we haven't done in the past? And one thing that we're going to be putting into this report is, maybe we should be ranking university courses in terms of their compatibility with biodiversity and climate targets. And when we as academics want to develop a new course, our university shouldn't allow us to put forward a course that doesn't have a statement about how it's compatible with net zero targets. If we had a ranking in the same way that we have rankings in terms of employability or in terms of time with academics or whatever, all these rankings we have on universities, if we had one that demonstrated the climate resilience of the skills that you're developing, I think that could send a clear signal to students as to which universities and which programs they should take in order to ensure the skills they're developing are compatible with the economy we're moving towards. Right? So if you have an engineering degree, it had better teach you more about electric vehicles and battery technologies and a high-tech grid than it does about the internal combustion engine. That's one of the things that I think we could be doing. One of the things where we struggle, Cristina, is, what do we do for the current stock of human capital, the people who are already employed in the labor force? We know there's going to be massive transitions if we want to get to net zero. Vehicle mechanics, the entire vehicle production supply chain is going to change. We know that the utilities system is going to change. The transport sector is going to change. The food sector will change. There will be massive displacement of jobs. On top of all of this, from the move to net zero, we will also have automation, and we need to find a way of protecting the lives and the livelihoods of the people who are going to be otherwise lost in transition. We've failed to do that in the past, and the clearest example is the shift away, closing the mines 50 years ago. Those communities are still struggling under that burden. Cheap talk about reskilling and retooling, I don't think it's going to cut it. I wouldn't be particularly impressed by somebody who tells me, well, you're going to reskill as a plumber now. It wouldn't work.
We have a question from Valerio. Valerio, if you can unmute yourself, because I don't find you in the screen, and you can ask your question.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Matthew, for the talk. My question is a bit convoluted because obviously I'm not an economist, but I've been following a little bit on these on topics. And I thought you mentioned in your talk that, you mentioned briefly about degrowth. And from my understanding, you weren't particularly supportive of this view. But I was thinking, there is increasing evidence that shows that it's hardly possible to decouple economic growth from environmental impact, including CO2 emissions and environmental destruction. And on top of that, the more we become efficient at developing technology to reduce our impact, we also increase our energy output, the Jevons paradox, which makes decoupling very hard overall. And on top of that, most of the emissions and most of the impacts are coming from the top 1%, top 10% of the wealthiest people in the world. And so clearly to me, the growth seems like a clear way forward. And I was just wondering whether you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerio, for an excellent question. I have this degrowth versus growth battle all the time. I gave a talk on it to the Cambridge Alumni Festival just a couple of weeks ago. The challenge here is that as long as you are focused on increasing, growing, or decreasing degrowth in GDP, then you've already missed the plot. It's the wrong question. We know that GDP is not a particularly good measure of welfare in the economy, right? We know that GDP includes lots of things that we don't want it to include or we don't want to increase. We know that, for instance, if there's an oil spill, the more expensive it is to clean up, the higher is GDP. We know that the more damage from property, from fires, and then the recovery in rebuilding those properties, the higher is GDP. This is silly. We shouldn't be basing our views of growth or degrowth on this metric. Not at all. If instead we were talking about increasing or decreasing that stock of economic ingredients, the skills and knowledge and the health of the workforce, the natural capital assets, the ecosystems, forests, biomes that underpin the rest of economic activity, the quality of our physical infrastructure and our access to it so that everybody can benefit from the economy. If we're talking about increasing or decreasing those stock of wealth, those capitals, then I think we have a very different question on our hands. And growth there is very definitely a good thing. There's one more point that I'll make on the degrowth issue. It is politically completely unacceptable. Try talking to a policymaker about how we're going to shrink GDP and lose jobs. You're not going to get very much traction. Maybe that's a bit glib. Think about it this way instead. 2/3 of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. Tell those people that they should reduce their income and consumption. I won't have it. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you very much, Valeria. I'm sorry for the 2 questions that remained unanswered. Probably partially Matthew has answered Anthony's question a little bit. The other one keeps unanswered, but well, this is a current debate and we will be all talking about it. Yeah. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Matthew,